Welcome everyone to our breakout session with Avoiding Ethical Pitfalls and Counselor Considerations for Telehealth. We have Dr. Kendra Jackson and Dr. Jenny Chien who are setting up at this time. And so Jenny and Kendra, whenever you're ready to go, you are co-hosts and you may feel free to take it away. I'll be here monitoring the chat window for you. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in there. And everyone mute your mics if not already, if you haven't done so already. And thank you so much. And we're looking forward to this awesome talk.
Thanks, Diane. Can you all see and hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. We have two screens going, so we're sort of looking back and forth. So if we're not looking at you, it's because we're looking at a second screen here. How are we on time, Diane? Do you think we should get started or wait another moment for folks to join us?
I think you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay.
People are jumping on and we already have several participants. So if you ladies are ready, just take it away.
Okay.
Thank you
I think
so
we're
much.
ready. Thanks. Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Dr. Jackson, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce us if you would like to.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
I was just fixing my lovely lighting here. Well, good morning, everyone. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Diane. So my name is Kendra Jackson, and this is my lovely friend and colleague, Dr. Jenny Chien. We're both assistant professors of clinical mental health counseling at Cornerstone University. And we are extremely passionate about teaching as well as engaging in clinical practice and have experience with working in a variety of settings, including schools, universities, outpatient settings, respite, crisis centers. We've probably, if you think of any type of setting, may have entered it and had some experience there, which is lovely. And so in the recent year, we have been engaging in telehealth and really conversations about that. And so although these telehealth services existed or telemedicine services have existed before the manifestation of COVID, this type of therapeutic modality has really served as an alternative to providing counseling, support, and overall assisting really with the continuity of care for clients and students in the midst of the pandemic. And so counselors are really have found creative ways to facilitate a meaningful experience and with clients, ways that definitely serve as a catalyst for promoting this positive change, growth, healing, and transformation. But one thing, we've begun to notice is that in the midst of providing telehealth, oftentimes we as counselors, we find ourselves so focused on the provision of services and the care of our clients that we end up falling into pitfalls that we end up having some difficulty of kind of getting out of. And so it is definitely our goal through this presentation that we provide you all with strategies and implications to assist counselors with avoiding those ethical pitfalls that will enable you all to do what you do best, and which is really providing care to clients.
Great, thank you. So we'll provide a little overview of what we hope to accomplish today. Please feel free to use the chat. We'll have some times where we are asking for your participation, and you're welcome to either unmute yourself and speak up, or you're welcome to use the chat as well so that we can be engaging you. But we're going to start out by just taking a look at what have been your experiences specifically in this past year with telehealth and any experiences you might have had prior to the COVID-19 crisis. We'll be looking at a case involving telehealth, and we'll sort of frame our time with the case, and then we'll revisit it a little later in our presentation. We'll talk specifically about what is telehealth and what does it encompass, and also take a look at our guiding ethical codes. So if you're a mental health clinician, taking a look at the ACA Code of Ethics. If you are a school counselor, taking a look at the ASCA ethical standards for school counselors. We want to spend some time identifying the potential ethical pitfalls specifically, and then revisit our case with an eye towards those pitfalls, and then we'll end up with some strategies for avoiding those pitfalls. Okay.
And so as we begin to really explore this topic of telehealth and ethics that surround this therapeutic modality, we would like to engage you in a dialogue really about your experience with telehealth. What has that been like for you? How have you used technology in telehealth? How has that changed since the onset of the pandemic? And what were some of the challenges, or what are some of the challenges that you have been faced with in the midst of providing telehealth services to either clients or students? And so we would really like to hear about your experiences.
And again, whatever way you feel comfortable with that, if you're comfortable to unmute yourself and share verbally, we'd be happy to hear from you. And then otherwise, if you'd be more comfortable to type those into the chat, we can read off some of your experiences with telehealth.
There was a little glitch with the audio there for a second. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure.
Absolutely. So what has been your experience with telehealth? How have your usage of technology and telehealth changed since the onset of the pandemic? And what has been some of the challenges that you have faced in the midst of providing telehealth services, whether it was to clients or to students, depending on the setting that you're in?
I'm going to also put those questions in the chat so that you can see them.
So Jody has indicated that she's been using Zoom as a platform to make sure that she's yet connecting with students and families. Diane have been conducting counseling sessions with telehealth during COVID, making sure that she's yet connecting with the clients that she's working with, and once again, that provision and continuity of care.
Any challenges that any of you have encountered with telehealth?
Jody indicates that prior to COVID, they didn't use Zoom as a platform for students. The barrier can be access students, absolutely. Issues, tech problems with clients, internet access, tech going in and out. No matter how much technology advances, right, we still yet find ourselves running into these technological glitches. So it happens.
Yes, it's funny. Yesterday, actually, as we were preparing for this, my internet went out. And so Kendra and I were trying to work together, and I'm in the middle of that, placing a call to Spectrum, getting a hotspot enabled. And we were kind of chuckling that, this is sort of some of the challenges that we encounter with telehealth. Yes, I also see hard to read. Diane is sharing hard to read facial expressions and sometimes more difficult to build rapport, and can take more time to build rapport in a telehealth setting. Great. We'll keep thinking of those challenges that you might be encountering, or how the field has shifted a little bit as we continue through. We want to introduce you to our case study now. And right now I'm just going to read it to you, and then be thinking about it as we start to go through our content here and start to look at some of the ethical concerns, and just be listening here for where you might hear and see some ethical concerns in the case. So here's our case. Chris is a 48-year-old single heterosexual male inventory clerk who lives alone. A resident of Austin, Texas, he has sought telehealth counseling with Chien, an LPC living in LA and holding licenses in both California and New York. Counseling sessions are scheduled weekly through a video conferencing platform. Because there's a 2-hour time difference and Chris works until 5 Central Time, Chien does not meet with him until 6 p.m., which is 4 p.m. in California. Hold on a second, allow me to advance the slide. Chris's presenting problem was an inability to forge a lasting personal relationship. He was married once before for 6 months, after which his wife filed for divorce. It has been 6 years since the divorce, and Chris states he's been unable to date anyone for more than a couple of times. He states, quote, "Nobody ever likes me. At first they seem to be interested, but then they refuse to go out again with me. I know I will never find anyone." After 4 weeks of counseling, Chris begins to express suicidal ideation, stating, quote, "There's nothing to live for. No one will even care if I die. I have a dead-end job and a dead-end life. I can't go on like this. When Chien asks Chris if he has thought of hurting himself, he responds with, yes, I don't want to live anymore. And when asked if he had a plan, he replies, I don't know. I'm afraid of pain, but I do have some sleeping pills, but I don't know if I could ever go through with it. So start thinking as we move forward into, in a little bit, talking about some of the ethical concerns, where you might see some ethical concerns in this case and strategies you might utilize to address those.
So technology and the counseling profession. And so the technological landscape has changed the way that counselors and the profession as a whole, how we operate. And so counselors are utilizing a variety of technologies to assist with the delivery of services and to navigate other essential components that are embedded in the role and responsibilities of the counselor, such as record keeping, right? And so some clinicians are using electronic record system. School counselors might be storing data a little bit differently, student data, completing documentation such as progress notes, billing, diagnosing, treatment planning, and engaging in what we call the case conceptualization process, regardless of the setting that you're in, right? So we're using technology to engage in those responsibilities. Also, we as counselors utilize technology to engage in the assessment process, and we find ourselves, both LPCs and school counselors, administering a variety of assessment instruments and providing testing to help with care, addressing the mental health needs of clients and students, as well as promoting career development and academic success with the students that we're working with. And so the profession is even utilizing, gotten creative with using interactive videos, DVDs, and apps to really begin to augment treatment and support for clients and students, and to assist them with developing new skills that will help promote wellness and overall client growth. And so as technology continues to advance, counselors and the profession overall will continually find themselves really utilizing computers and other modes of technology in clinical practice. That will continue. So telehealth, or what some individuals may use the term telemedicine, this is the telemedicine term have been used and coined, and was coined since during the 1970s, which literally means is healing or facilitating healing at a distance. And that really signifies the usage of information communication technologies to really improve patient or client outcomes by increasing access to care and to medical information or mental health information. And so recognizing that there is no definitive definition of telemedicine, one thing that we've noticed in the literature, that there was a study, a 2007 study actually, that found 104 peer-reviewed definitions of the word telemedicine, the word telehealth. The World Health Organization, WHO, has adopted the following broad definition: the delivery of healthcare services where distance is a critical factor by all healthcare professionals using information and communication technologies for the exchange of valid information for diagnosing, treatment, and prevention of disease and injury, research, evaluation, and for continuing education of healthcare providers, all in the interest of advancing the health of individuals and the communities that they are part of. And so as we can see on this particular slide, the Center for Connected Health Policy uses an alternate word to telemedicine, and they utilize telehealth, in which they define telehealth in a similar manner, but there's some slight differences. And so the slide defines telehealth as the use of electronic information and telecommunication technologies to support long-distance clinical health care patient and professional health-related education, public health, and health administration. And so although, right, this definition is a definition that some helping professions may embrace, one thing that, I try to help counselors keep in mind is that the definitions of telehealth and telemedicine may differ from state to state, or even depending on the professions that we're in, right? Some of us are school counselors, some of us are LPCs in various settings. Some are, let's say, think about social workers and psychologists, right? And so that definition of telehealth and what that might include might be a little bit different. And then please know that the definition, right, is constantly evolving and will continue to honestly evolve as technology continues to advance and as services adapt to the changing health needs in the context of society. I think that the thing to remember is that telehealth is really a collection of means or methods for really enhancing healthcare, public health, and health education delivery and support using those telecommunication technologies. And so telehealth really begins to encompasses a variety of technologies and tactics to deliver virtual medicine and mental health and education services to individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and building on that, just as Kendra referred to, because there isn't really an agreed upon definition, if you will, we also see a number of different terms utilized in the literature, in the professions, and the ethical codes, and that can create a little bit of confusion, right? So even if we're doing a literature search on best practices in telehealth, we might want to be aware of how some of these terms are used interchangeably or are used with a slightly different nuance depending, again, on the profession. So sometimes you'll hear telehealth, teletherapy, telemedicine, telepsychotherapy, telemental health, distance counseling. The ACA code refers to telehealth as distance counseling, web counseling, internet counseling, virtual or distance counseling, and distance professional services are just some of the interchangeable terms. And again, the ethical codes sometimes term these a little differently as well. So it's important to know your profession, your state, your ethical code, what are the terms that are used so that you can be seeking out best practices. It's also important that we consider telehealth platforms are now being utilized, of course, for counseling, for social work, for medical in the medical field, but we're also seeing them being used for more things as well, even as we prepare to meet with our accountants this spring, or if you've had any legal proceedings over this past year, the court system may have been dealt with through tele platforms as well. So we're seeing a number of different fields using these platforms again, which is just sort of adding to some of the maybe confusion in the terminology. So just be aware of the ways that it is termed in the literature and the codes.
On this slide, we just really wanted to share what are some of the common telehealth methods for the provision of distance professional services. And so that include telephone based, which is, a synchronous distance interaction. Here it is, you're exchanging information only through audio means with your client or with your student. There's email based that refers, this is asynchronous distance interaction in which information is being received through written text messages or email. There's chat-based component, receiving written messages. There's video based as well, the synchronous distance interaction in which information is received via video and audio mechanisms. There's a social network based method as well. And that can be synchronous or asynchronous in terms of those interactions. And this is where you're using social networking mechanisms to communicate. And so all of the above mentioned examples and that have been identified on the slide are examples of distance professional services that may be conducted honestly with individuals, with couples, families, groups, students. I think that the important thing though is that counselors that they really need to be able to consider that as they engage in these common telehealth methods, to really make sure that they are navigating those those methods in an ethical manner.
We want to take a look at both the advantages to telehealth and some disadvantages on the next slide. So I'm going to start by outlining some of the advantages. I'm going to skip down to the synchronous or asynchronous or asynchronous, depending on how you pronounce that. And it didn't occur to us to define that, but that might be important for those of you that are newer to telehealth. So a synchronous platform is like what we're on now, where we are seeing and hearing each other in real time. We're communicating directly to one another, versus an asynchronous platform, which might be like a chat platform or something where a client can put in a question or a comment or give you a bit of a paragraph about what's going on, and then you would respond at a later time. You're not necessarily both interacting at the same time. So both platforms are used in telehealth, and there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to each of those. One of the big advantages to telehealth is just increased access to services. We know that there can sometimes be problems with internet and connection that we'll talk about on the next slide, but also consider for people that maybe have mobility issues or transportation is a concern, or lack of access to transportation or to reliable transportation. Telehealth platforms can really help increase the availability of counseling services to people that are maybe homebound. Also during COVID-19, we have, of course, so many children that are in and out of the school system. And so parents are in a lot of cases home and providing care at home in ways that they maybe weren't doing prior to that health crisis. So definitely increased access to care. Can also help with continuity of care, where again, if we have a client who we've seen in person and then we have a health crisis, either like COVID-19, or maybe they have a personal crisis or a health crisis happening to them individually, rather than break in care until we can resume and meet back face to face, we're able to continue that treatment through the telehealth platform. Definitely reduced travel time, as people are able to connect from home or connect from the convenience of their office on a lunch break or things like that. They might be able to get in a therapy session during a time that they might not otherwise be able to do that. Of course, the convenience factor, I think we all have enjoyed part of this transition to telehealth and to using teleplatforms, is just being able to be home in our yoga pants and be comfortable and be in a convenient location where we're not having to transition and prep to get out of the house or out of work. Of course, we're seeing increased need and demand for this during COVID-19. I talked about asynchronous and synchronous. Definitely also as well, just integration of caregivers and professionals in treatment. I know one thing that I've talked about with some of my practicum and internship students who are providing telehealth services in the home for minors, and perhaps those of you that are school counselors are doing some of this as well, is the uniqueness to really have parents able to be integrated into care, and also the uniqueness to really be able to see the home environment, see some of the dynamics at home, can really be helpful in establishing what is best treatment and what is best care for those particular clients. And again, we know there is stigma associated with receiving mental health services. So sometimes just increasing access, increasing convenience can help reduce the stigma of mental health and make it more accessible for clients that need the care.
Although my lovely colleague mentioned many of the advantages to providing telehealth services, there are also some disadvantages that we have to consider. And so one thing is the resistance to actually embracing this type of modality. And so we have to consider, right, that there's human and cultural factors to consider. Some clients and even professionals may resist to adopting services that differ from traditional approaches or indigenous practices. Also, we have to realize that there are clients who just aren't comfortable with utilizing technology. And to be honest, because we are in a digital age and there is so much advancement as it relates to technology, I mean, we also sometimes make the assumption that all individuals have access to technology, and that just isn't true. And so the lack of access to technology is another disadvantage. Think about individuals who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and may live in rural areas where technology may not be as accessible to some, or the connection may not be good enough to sustain the counseling session that may be occurring via telehealth. There's also lack of information and technology literacy. That is also a disadvantage, right? Some individuals we may be working with may not have the required technological skills to engage in this type of modality with us. There's licensing and lack of training and competency. Specifically in regards to licensing, there are many issues in relation to telehealth services, especially when we start considering, right, conducting sessions across state or national borders. And so we have to really think about, you know, when we begin to do that, we have to think about legislative, licensing, cultural differences, right? For instance, it may be unclear whether the therapy is seeing, the therapist is seeing where it's taking place, right? What's the location of the counseling session, either for the client or for the counselor. And so raising such questions as to which jurisdiction is responsible when a problem arises, or which state will regulate the professional practice in the event of a violation. And so the therapist may not even know or cannot be sure where the client is even located, especially if they choose to remain anonymous. And so also in terms of licensing, states vary in terms of licensure requirements, laws, regulations, and even vary once again in how telehealth is defined. And for some countries, right, there's a variation in how counseling is defined. So it makes practicing across state borders and country borders very difficult and can be an ethical pitfall. When we think about training and competency, typically, if I reflect back to my master's and doctoral programs, right, training wasn't provided in terms of how do we engage with clients in the provision of care using telehealth. And so in order to engage effectively in this modality and properly care for the clients that we're working with, we have to be able to ascertain the needed training and the competency as it relates to, you know, both counseling, but also how to navigate technology as well. There's another disadvantage, potential miscommunication or language barriers, cultural differences with clients, between the client and the counselor that impacts communication and provided services. And so due to language barriers, and or even other cultural factors, this can contribute to misinterpretations as it relates to reported information from the client and vice versa, and can definitely contribute to misunderstandings occurring in the therapeutic process and the relationship. There's also privacy, confidentiality and security issues, you know, as it relates to telehealth. The usage of unsecure websites or unencrypted communication tools. Some things get software is hacked, or, you know, the issue that was going on with Zoom not too long ago, getting Zoom bombed. And so data security may also be compromised when technology fails. So that's also something to think about. And with potential breaches of confidentiality, this extends beyond, honestly, the therapist's control. And so it is a disadvantage. Investment in technology and equipment. You want to make sure that if you're providing telehealth services, that you got, if not top-notch, close to top-notch quality equipment, high internet speed, and great bandwidth to be able to sustain your sessions virtually. And so it can get kind of costly as you begin to invest in such equipment. Then you have a disadvantage, right? Like, yes, there's the advantage that Dr. Chien mentioned of it increases access to a variety of clients, right? That is very true. And there comes this sense of convenience, absolutely, with telehealth services. However, right, we got to be very honest that we love our clients and we work with clients, but not all clients are appropriate for telehealth. Think about individuals who may have a severe mental disorder, or clients who are highly dysfunctional or pose as a threat to themselves or others. Depending on their presenting concern, a client may be experiencing distortions of reality, suicidal ideation, current or previous victimization of violence or sexual abuse. And so a client's inability or diminished competence or even discomfort when using technology can serve as barriers, thus really making telehealth ineffective and inappropriate for the client and making it a disadvantage to telehealth services.
Thanks, Kendra. We're going to pivot and talk a little bit about the ethical guidelines, and there's much more detail in the actual documents here, but we're going to provide just an overview of both the ACA code and ASCA. Specifically in section H of the ACA code, it deals exclusively with distance counseling, what we are referring to as telehealth, technology, and the use of social media. I didn't unpack each of these categories here just in terms of time and length of our presentation, but I did want to show you the basic categories and give you kind of an overview of what you can look for there. So H1 talks about knowledge and competency, right? And so that's those two pieces. Knowledge, again, you'll hear us say over and over again, of state laws, of regulation, of insurance compliance is really important, but also competency in using telehealth. Have you received additional training in telehealth? Are you competent in the platform that you're using? Do you feel comfortable in navigating that platform and knowing how to use the various features of that? You might consider there are, you can obtain, of course, ongoing CEU and ongoing trainings in telehealth, either through something like you're attending today, or whether that's a formal training or certification through NBCC has a distance counselor credential that you can pursue, and other organizations like PESI and other continuing education organizations have lots of different platforms that you can engage to increase your competency in telehealth if that's something that you need some additional training in. H2 outlines informed consent and security. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about specifically what ACA says has to be in informed consent for telehealth. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But also just to think about, who is your client? Is the client an adult or a minor? Are you doing marital work or family work or couple work? And how might that shift or look a little bit different? And how might the informed consent process look a little different depending on the client population you're serving? Kendra mentioned in the previous slide security, but that all has to be outlined as well. What are the concerns? What are the risks with security? Clients need to be made aware of both the risks and benefits when using a telehealth platform. H3 outlines concerns for client verification. We'll talk about this in a later slide, but basically assuring how do you know that the person you're meeting with on the other side of the screen is who they say they are? So how are you verifying client identity to be sure of confidentiality and continuity of care and just services are ethical and appropriate? H4 talks about the distance counseling relationship. So think about the other sections in the ACA that deal with counseling relationships specifically and talking about, alliance, boundaries, how do we assess for effectiveness of counseling services? How do we deal with access? How also maybe do we deal with anything regarding accommodations that need to be made for clients? So that is all addressed in H4. H5 talks about records and web maintenance. So again, how are we maintaining records in a way that is compliant, in a way that is ethical? What are clients' rights to access records and how do we manage that when they're not in the same locale as us? And then finally, H6 talks about the use of social media. So both our online presence in social media, perhaps we advertise our counseling services through social media, our own personal presence rather through social media. Is that locked down or is that viewable for public consumption? And then also minding our clients' privacy so that we're not friending our clients on social media, that we're not accepting friend requests on social media. How are we navigating those challenges sometimes with social media when clients do friend request us or follow us on Instagram or those sorts of things? How do we keep both a professional and personal presence on social media and maintain that in an ethical way? I want to take a quick look at what the ACA code outlines for us needs to be included in informed consent, specifically for distance counseling. So we know there are requirements for informed consent for face-to-face counseling, but these are specific to telehealth services. What you'll see here, the lines you see in blue are the ones that I think are specific to telehealth, right? So some of the others are consistent with both in-person and telehealth practices, but I outline the ones that I think really stand out as being needed to be specified specifically with telehealth. So first of all, what are our credentials to offer distance counseling or telehealth services? Yes, we should always be noting our physical location and our contact information. We also need to outline specifically not just the risks and benefits of therapy, but the risks and benefits in the use of telehealth counseling, technology, or social media. Also outlining to clients that there may be a possibility of technology failure and what to do if that occurs. Anticipated response time, emergency procedures, and we'll talk more about this in our strategies, because yes, we should be outlining both for in-person and telehealth counseling, what are those emergency procedures, but those might differ a little bit when we're utilizing a telehealth platform. Absolutely, if you are practicing in a different time zone area or you're counseling clients across state lines or national borders, you need to consider time zone differences and access to services. Dr. Jackson had mentioned this, but cultural and language differences that can affect delivery of services. Also, just education around the possible denial of insurance benefits. Yes, since COVID-19, we have seen insurance companies reimburse for telehealth platforms much more regularly than they did in the past, but we still need to be mindful that that's not a guarantee, and we need to do due diligence to make sure our clients are aware of that. And then, of course, our social media policy should also be outlined in informed consent. So those are the ethical guidelines outlined in the ACA. Kendra will talk a little bit about the ASCA guidelines for school counselors.
Yeah, so for school counselors, the ASCA Code of Ethics provides standards and guiding ethical behavior, right, for school counselors. And so as it relates to specifically technology and the provision of virtual and distance school counseling services. And so on this slide, I'm pointing out two sections from the ASCA Code of Ethics. So that's that A14 piece and that A15. And so section A14 focuses on technical and digital citizenship. And so under this particular code, school counselors, right, have to be able to demonstrate appropriate, right, selection of and usage of the technology and any software applications that they're planning on using as they navigate services with students. And so as they select the appropriate technology and applications, right, they have to keep in mind really this academic, career, personal, and social emotional development of the students that they're working with. As they consider the technology and the software applications that they're going to be utilizing, school counselors must also ethically take into consideration, right? How does that impact confidentiality? How does that impact security? How does that, impact the services, the communication practices through electronic media? But we also have to think about how does that contribute to potential limitations and benefits, right? The technology and the applications that we're selecting to use as school counselors. School counselors also have to really begin to take the necessary steps to ensure that confidentiality as it relates to student information, educational records, social media, phones, voicemails, and other technology mediums, that they're taking the necessary steps to protect the student as much as possible and that information as much as possible. So what might that look like for you as a school counselor if that applies? School counselors ethically have to promote safe and appropriate use of technology as they work not only with the student directly, but also as they engage in interactions with parents and families, but also other school personnel. And so making sure that the appropriate technology is selected and that is being used appropriately within those interactions. Promoting benefits and clarifying limitations, making sure that that's evident and clear to the families and students that you are interacting and serving with. Using established and approved means of communication, making sure that school counselors are maintaining appropriate boundaries and communicating what those boundaries are to students and to families as well. School counselors also under this A14 piece, that here it is that school counselors, one thing I tell students all the time is that we don't just remain in our office and meet with clients or meet with students, but we also embrace their role as advocates. And this A14 piece specifically, one of the pieces under that code indicates how school counselors will serve in the role as advocates as they really promote equal access of technology for all students. And so that's what come along with in terms of technology, the appropriate use of technology, and what that all entails. That all of that falls under that A14 piece. This A15 code, though, that standard focuses on specifically this virtual distance school counseling piece. And so although school counselors are utilizing this alternative method in order to provide school counseling services, the school counselors still have to abide by and adhere to the same guidelines, right, as if they were meeting with the student in their office or in the classroom or wherever, right? They yet have to maintain those ethical guidelines. And that's something that section A15 points out. That same section also indicates that school counselors must not only recognize, but that they must acknowledge the challenges related to distance and virtual school counseling. And as they recognize that and acknowledge that, making sure that they effectively communicate that to parents and students as well, helping them to be familiar with the benefits and the limitations. And once again, school counselors definitely want to make sure that they are conveying the information clearly so that they're aware. When issues emerge, right, school counselors, this also falls under section A15, school counselors really have to be able to have a plan how we're going to address these emergency situations. And so whether there's an emergency situation or a non-emergency situation, there has to be plans and procedures in place. And that needs to also be communicated effectively to students, school personnel, and family also, so that all constituents are aware, so we can facilitate that process clearly and effectively. Couple other things in regards to section A15. School counselors really bear the responsibility to educate students on how to participate in electronic school counseling relationships, really to aid to minimizing and preventing potential misunderstandings that could occur due to lack of verbal cues, because sometimes reading verbal cues can be very difficult when you're navigating telehealth or distance school counseling. But also this inability to read body language and other visual cues that provide contextual meaning to the school counseling process and the school counseling relationship. And so all those components really fall under this section A15 that school counselors need to be mindful of to lean into so that they can engage in ethical school counseling practices while best serving the students.
We're going to transition a little bit and start talking about some of the ethical pitfalls that you may encounter as you work in telehealth.
And so it is definitely imperative that we lean into those ethical codes and those standards. Those are foundational to our practices, whether we are LPCs or licensed school counselors. Failure to adhere to those standards can create potential ethical pitfalls. And so if we are lacking, for instance, right, if we're lacking training on how to determine which therapeutic approaches and interventions are suitable for telehealth, if we aren't seeking professional development opportunities so that counselors can effectively navigate telehealth with students and clients, then we can do more harm than good. And as you can see, this can be an ethical pitfall that counselors fall into. Also, there is other pitfalls that are listed on this slide. So the profession hopes to definitely, if we're looking at following state regulations, state of the counselor and the client. Granted, one thing about the counseling profession, we're working and hoping to achieve licensure portability. However, we haven't reached and accomplished that goal yet. And so Once again, states vary in licensure requirements. They vary in statutes and laws and regulations. So if we aren't taking into consideration the laws and the statutes and the regulations that guide our practice for not only the state we're actually licensed in, but also the state that the client is residing in, then we are definitely getting ready to sink into a major ethical pitfall. And this can lead to really a potential litigation and malpractice. There are a variety of technology platforms and distance that can be used for distance counseling, but all of them aren't HIPAA compliant. And so this is an ethical issue and pitfall, and it increases the likelihood of breaches to confidentiality, privacy, security of records, and your client's information. Major ethical pitfall. Also, third-party insurers, right, and reimbursement. When it comes to third-party insurers, payment, reimbursement, fee structures, and billing for telehealth services, that raises like a lot of questions and eyebrows. And so what happens if there's an interruption or a technical failure? How will that be handled? How does that build? And another important thing is, you know, whether insurers will, and Jenny mentioned this before, will even cover telehealth in general. Granted, there's a lot of flexibility now, but what happens afterwards and years later? And so that can definitely lead to some major concerns. Think about malpractice and liability issues, right? It can definitely be very, very complicated to even bill insurances when we're navigating or crossing over state and national borders. That can definitely create an ethical dilemma if that isn't taken into consideration.
Yeah, you'll hear us repeatedly talk about sort of state and national borders. I would just like to sort of put out there that I think best practices that we practice in the states where we're licensed. So if a client is, you know, if we're licensed in Michigan and a client is located in Colorado, we might want to think about if that is really best practice or if that's ethical, and how we would maintain that. And then just in terms of just the physical distance as well, I'm licensed in both Michigan and Florida, but obviously there's a pretty large geographical discrepancy between Michigan and Florida, and how would I navigate some of the things that we see here. The ability to screen clients first and foremost for appropriateness for telehealth services. So sometimes that is appropriate, and if it's possible to screen a person in person, have a face-to-face session and screen for appropriateness for telehealth. Sometimes that's not appropriate, but as Kendra mentioned earlier, we want to think about what might be those client presentations, those diagnoses that just might not be appropriate for telehealth services. What might be things where clients need more support or where it's just not an appropriate platform, and make sure that we are referring clients early, or as soon as it becomes apparent that they're not appropriate for telehealth services, that we have a network of referrals where we can connect a client to what they really need and to the best services to meet their needs. We've talked about this and we'll continue to talk about it, but notifying clients of the advantages and limitations of telehealth. I think even more importantly is establishing those emergency procedures. So again, even within the state of Michigan, we're a pretty large state. And if I'm licensed but residing in Grand Rapids and I have a client who's in Detroit who ends up in an emergency, do I know who to call in Detroit? Do I know who to call where that client is and how to get them established to the resources they might need? Do I know what the inpatient options are for them? Do I know what the mobile crisis options are for them? So those are things that we need to be aware of as the clinician and have those things ready should we need them, and not ready before we need them, ready in anticipation that we will need them, right? Hoping for the best, hoping that clients maintain care and maintain health, but recognizing that these are very challenging times and people can decompensate very quickly. So we need to be prepared for that. Also maintaining appropriate records, as we talked about, and making sure clients have access to those. And Kendra talked a lot about those encryption services. How are we maintaining records in a secure manner?
So there are, here on this slide, there are other ethical pitfalls to kind of be mindful of while engaging in telehealth. And so, for instance, failure to implement appropriate boundaries, right? This is something we really have to consider because this can damage the relationship that has been established between the client and the counselor, or the student and the counselor. And so this can also lead to the abuse of technology and individuals really engaging in unprofessional behaviors. And so we want to make sure that, right, we are setting up those boundaries ahead of time at the onset of the relationship, and that those boundaries are clear between you and the student or you and the client. Once again, failure to ensure confidentiality and security, major pitfall. There needs to be this encryption and other components to ensure the client or student privacy. Establishing a plan for technology failure, right? Although we hope that technology cooperate all the time, the real world thing is technology doesn't, right? And so what do you do if you are in the middle of a session and the technology fails? What if the client is in crisis or dealing with the severe mental health issues and technology fails? When technology fails, what is your game plan? Some people don't have one. And so without having a plan in place, this can lead to issues with the continuity of care and the provision of services. This can also cause the client to feel abandoned in the moment. They could begin to feel very frustrated and angry. And honestly, that could really, exacerbate client or student symptoms and behaviors. And so that is something to be mindful of. And also think about how distracting technological failures can be to the therapeutic process. Also, develop competency in writing and articulating nonverbal behavior. And then there's also ensuring you are working with the intended client, right? So when you are providing telehealth, who are you really working with? Is the client really your client? It may be difficult, honestly, to verify the identity of the client or even the counselor online. What if the client's camera is not working or off? And so this can lead to, if we're not careful and not taking this into consideration, this can lead to major deception or even fraud. And this may contribute to issues surrounding like consent. This can become multi-layered. For example, right, a therapist might inadvertently treat a minor without parental consent, and the counselor may not know that the individual that they are speaking to or working with is actually a minor. And so, like many of the other ethical pitfalls that were mentioned, this can be an ethical pitfall that counselors struggle to recover from.
We want to take a look back in light of the ethical pitfalls we just talked about, go back and reconsider our case. We won't read it again, but just with what you remember about it. And feel free again to pop this in the chat or unmute yourself and talk about this. But what ethical pitfalls do you see highlighted in the case we presented at the beginning of our presentation? And anything you see there that might violate the ACA Code of Ethics? You can answer any of these. How would you navigate these challenges? What would you do if you were the counselor in the case? And if you felt you needed assistance, who would you contact and why? So I'll pop those questions. I think I can do this here. Nope, it's not going to let me do it. I will see if I can pop those questions into the chat without retyping all of them, but let's keep them up. Actually, let's keep them up here so you can see them. And then feel free to respond to any of those that you think where you feel there have been some ethical pitfalls identified.
So Jenny, I put a question in prior about how to develop a safety plan for this client and where do I report, who do I contact if they're in a different state and it's 2 hours different and they have no relationships.
Right, that's a great question and definitely an ethical consideration in the case, right? If we go back and remember the case, the client had expressed some suicidal ideation and at least gave indication of having potentially planned and lethal means, but then also indicated that he didn't have any relationships where he was located. So that would be on the counselor first and foremost to know who are those emergency contacts. And if a person really doesn't have any emergency contacts local to where they are, you might argue that they are not appropriate for telehealth, right? So first and foremost, if they can't identify some safe people in their proximity that they can call or you can call in the event of an emergency, they might not be an appropriate candidate for the platform. The other challenge is if you remember the counselor was located in California, the client was located in Texas, it would still be on the responsibility, if you will, of the counselor to determine what are emergency services in the location where the client is located. So that might require some work on our part, right? To figure out who are those emergency services. Is that the local police in that area? Is there a mobile crisis unit that will come and assess? Is there an inpatient facility where the client can go? If the client can't get himself to that facility, how do you do that? And then just think about those technicalities of like you're on the screen with someone, right? And maybe you need to make some of these calls. So how do you navigate all of that ethically? And in some cases, you're able to, communicate directly with the client. Like, I'm concerned, these are the calls I need to make. Let's stay on the screen while you make the call, while I make the call, and you're able to do those things together. But also consider that if the client just abruptly ends the telehealth communication, who do you call? Right? So ideally, you have outlined those things as a clinician before they occur. You have those emergency contacts for the person, and you've established what are emergency services in the area where the client is residing, and you have those available to you, right? So you're not at home doing your telehealth session and those documents are back at your office in a locked cabinet somewhere, right? So all those things need to be considered when we take a look at this case. Great
Excellent.
questions.
And
Yeah.
can I add to that? Let's say you're a school counselor in a similar situation where a client is presenting with lethal means and suicidal ideation. What would a school counselor do in a Zoom session or telehealth session with a student?
Sure. Kendra, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Right. Some of what Jenny kind of mentioned, right? And also what that A15 piece of the ASCA code mentioned is, what is your game plan, right? And that's something that school counselors really have to think about before implementing this virtual school counseling services, making sure that there are plans and procedures put in place. Do you know, what does that plan consist of? Is the student aware also of that plan? Also thinking about who you as a school counselor need to contact, who is the child or student's guardian, if there's CPS issues. So being familiar with all the key constituents that you may need to contact. So that needs to be part of the development of that plan as school counselors. Once again, before the implementation of the virtual school counseling services.
But what if you're on the fly and this is happening without that?
Thanks again, Jess.
I think what we're stating is that shouldn't happen without that. Like, these things should be thought out before you engage in telehealth,
Absolutely.
Whether it's in a school-based setting or in a clinical setting. So if you're a school counselor and you're providing services through Google Meet or Zoom, you still want to have some of those things outlined for yourself, for the client, for the guardian, and do that in advance. We're recommending that to avoid pitfalls, you do some work up front, anticipating crisis, right? We hope we don't have crisis, but we prepare for it so that, you know how that goes, right? If we prepare for it, it won't occur. If we don't prepare for it, it does.
That's
so
when it happens.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So we always prepare for it, anticipating it, but then of course, hoping that that's not something we have to navigate.
Great questions.
Rooms are already.
Yeah,
That's
really
great. So we have 2 more minutes left of our session. So if anyone from the participant side would have any other questions, you may feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat.
Sure. We do have some remaining content just in terms of strategies, but basically the content that we've highlighted in terms of recommended strategies is really take those things that we said would be pitfalls and don't do them. Okay, so it's not super essential that we cover every single one of those. We divided that into strategies before you begin telehealth, before you even practice in telehealth, strategies kind of as your starting sessions, strategies in session to consider, and then just some strategies for professionalism. So we are happy to share that PowerPoint with Diane and the WMCA team, and then they can distribute that to any of you if you would like it. But we do have some time for questions.
Well, if you had any more content, if you wanted to pop through a few things, that would be fine too.
I can pop through quickly. We have a lot of strategies, but like I said, you'll basically see they're the opposite of what to avoid, right? So again, some of the things like before you engage in telehealth, like we've talked about, training, state laws, know your modality, encryption services, HIPAA compliant platforms, update your professional disclosure statement, right? So reflecting the type of counseling services you're providing. If you're in the state of Michigan as a clinical mental health counselor, you need to develop that professional disclosure statement, and we indicate there how we provide services. So you'd want to update that to indicate that you do provide telehealth. And this is the next part is in terms of like before you get started with the client, things to cover with them. Kendra, do you want to go through that really quickly?
Sure. So thinking about insurance plans, remember how we indicated that some may not cover telebehavioral health options. So making sure that you do your homework as clinicians to be able to contact, verify coverage and so forth, making sure that once again, you're providing consent for treatment. Make sure that your informed consent is actually updated and reflect modalities of telehealth, making sure that that's in there. Numerous benefits, but also indicating the risks. Make sure that you are sharing that information with your clients so that they can make the best decision for them if they even want to proceed with telehealth services. And definitely confidentiality, privacy, right? Making sure that you explain what those limitations are. Once again, the more informed your client or your students and families are, they can make the best decision on whether or not they want to engage in this type of therapeutic approach. Once again, appropriateness for telehealth services, right? There are assessment instruments, there's literature. How do you begin to see who may be a good fit for telehealth and who may not? And if someone isn't, how do you make sure that you find a way to make sure that they are getting the support and the provision of care that they need? Think about language and communication limitations. And my favorite part of the slide, right? Having an emergency plan in place. Whether there's a crisis or technology failure, what's your game plan? Have that in written form. Make sure that your client or your constituents have a copy of that, but make sure you are verbally communicating those procedures as well so that all people can be familiar with that process.
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, we have a couple additional slides that we'll be happy to share with participants. If there are any final questions, we're happy to take those now.
Well, I'm going to have to be the ugly duckling in the room and cut you
okay.
off, ladies.
That's all right.
What a fabulous presentation. We are at the end of our hour. So thank you, Kendra and Jenny, for your insightful and informative talk about ethics and concerns surrounding telehealth. I'm sure we all have something we can take away from your talk, and such a great reminder to know the codes and prepare in advance, have a safety plan or emergency plan in place. And I do quite a bit of telehealth, so I'm certainly going to be applying a couple of the things that you suggested, so that's great. And from here on out, we're going to suggest that our participants attend breakout rooms for all of our sponsors. And you can click on where to go here from here. Hold on, let me just get the instructions on that because I'm not really sure.
Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Brand new link I've never used.
Okay, so on the conference website, there's a brand new link there that says sponsor rooms. So go ahead and go to that location, and then you have a break for lunch, and we will see you back here at 1 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye, Jenny. Bye, Kendra. Thank you so much.